Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This is going to be a rather long video discussing some climate propaganda from the National Center for Atmospheric Research here in Boulder, Colorado. I have a long relationship with NCAR, and everyone I've ever worked with up there have been top quality scientists. The propaganda being disseminated is coming from the NCAR administrators, not from the scientists. And the worst of the propaganda is located in the NCAR Museum, which is visited by thousands of school children every year. In order to help you understand my relationship with NCAR, I'm going to take you first through 40 years of my own history. It will become clear later why I'm doing this. This is the official NCAR poster. As you can see, it's located in a very spectacular spot up above Boulder, Colorado. The building was designed during the 1960s by architect I.M. Pei, who passed away earlier this year. That's I.M. Pei on the left, and on the right is Walter Orr Roberts, the first director of the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Dr. Roberts was a very interesting guy, and I'll be talking a lot more about him later. I ride my bicycle almost every day up to NCAR, so let's start with a short trip to the top. Well, that was fun. Now let's go back in time 40 years. This is a paper I wrote with a couple of other authors at Los Alamos National Laboratories in 1980. President Carter started the Synthetic Fuels Corporation, whose job was to figure out a way to extract liquid fuels from oil shale and coal. The project I was working on was part of President Carter's efforts to reduce dependence on Middle Eastern oil. This was from before the days when Democrats were terrified by a harmless trace gas. The second guy in the paper was Guy R.B. Elliott, a brilliant chemist and a World War II hero. In 1980, Guy introduced me to the concept of global warming. There were a lot of hot years during the 1980s and 1990s, and it all seemed very believable. Now let's fast forward 20 years to the years 1999 and 2000. I was managing a microprocessor design project for Hitachi and ST Microelectronics. I was located in San Jose, California, but had designers in Tokyo, San Jose, Bristol, England, Grenoble, France, and Catania, Sicily. Needless to say, I was spending a lot of time on airplanes and didn't really have enough time to travel the way Greta Thunberg does. I was traveling from California to Bristol, England about once every 3 weeks. The weather was very warm in England during the late 1990s, and it never seemed to snow much anymore. I remember flying into Heathrow in February and seeing the grass green and people water skiing just west of the airport. As far as I was concerned, global warming was a very real thing. During that time, Dr. David Viner of the University of East Anglia announced that children just aren't going to know what snow is. And what he was saying certainly seemed to be believable at the time. Now let's fast forward to the year 2002. I was living in Longmont, Colorado and coaching kids soccer there. Colorado was having an historic drought at the time. The grass on the soccer fields was completely dead, and the city council shut down the soccer fields to all use. So I went to the city council and pled the case for kids soccer. The argument I used was that global warming was just going to make the situation worse over time, and the kids were simply going to have to learn how to play on hard surfaces like they do in Brazil. The city council bought my argument and opened up some of the fields to kids soccer, and we were back in business. That was a great learning year for the kids because they learned how to play on difficult surfaces and made them more competitive against kids from South America and Mexico. Now let's proceed to the beginning of my education about climate. This story is about to get very convoluted, but if you bear with me, you'll find out that it all ties together. Fast forward to the year 2003, and I was in England for a meeting with some venture capitalists. It was Robbie Burns night, and I was taking a train from London to Cambridge. It started snowing and kept snowing harder and harder. Eventually the train got stuck in the track a little bit outside of the train station in Cambridge. Based on projections by the Met Office and the University of East Anglia, the British government had largely stopped buying grit for the roads. So when the storm came, more than 10,000 motorists got trapped in their cars on the M11, which was turned into a virtual parking lot. It turned out that snow was not a thing of the past. I spent the night at the Flying Pig pub just up the street from the Cambridge train station. The Flying Pig was my favorite place in Cambridge. It was nearly demolished a few years ago, but was rescued at the last minute. It was terribly cold outside, but about 10 o'clock some guy came walking into the pub wearing shorts and a t-shirt which read, Longmont, Colorado. I went over to him and introduced myself as a resident of Longmont. It turned out he was a Brit who had visited Longmont a few years earlier. He fell in love with the lifestyle of wearing shorts and a t-shirt all the time, and that's what he did when he went back to England. He was a pretty funny guy, and pretty tough, too. A few weeks after the Robbie Burns night storm in England in 2003, Maryland had an historic snowstorm. It was their worst snowstorm in 120 years. And a few weeks after that, Colorado was also hit by an historic snowstorm, which ended the drought pretty quickly. It started occurring to me that whatever was going on with the climate appeared to be more cyclical than linear. So the year 2003 was when I began my serious thinking about what was going on with the climate. I took a lot of trips to Cambridge, England that year. Now I'm going to explain why. This is Warren East, who is the Chief Executive Officer of ARM Holdings, which was the fastest growing company in the world. They provided the microprocessors which were used in essentially all handheld computing devices at the time. But they were under threat from Microsoft, who wanted to develop a Windows handheld computer which was based around the Intel microprocessor architecture. Microsoft wanted to make a handheld computer which would also serve as your phone and as your camera. So I presented an idea to Warren East which he really liked. I told him that I could design a microprocessor for him which would run both the Intel instruction set and the ARM instruction set. Then he could sell his product into both markets. When I told him about this, he was immediately ready to write me a personal check as a retainer. He then introduced me to Hermann Hauser, who was probably the best-known venture capitalist in Europe. I then explained my idea to Hermann, whose eyes lit up and said, "This is going to be my third billion-dollar company." Well, it never happened because ARM figured out they were going to get sued by Intel if we tried to do this. So I ended up taking a different job as Vice President of Technology at a high-performance computing company in Bristol, England. And this is how my connection to NCAR began. I brought the specifications for our product to NCAR and suggested to him it might be a good way for them to speed up their weather and climate models. NCAR was very interested in what we were doing, but when our product came back from the fabs, I quickly realized that the performance was much lower than what I had been told to expect. I immediately brought this problem to NCAR's attention and told them to not buy our product. This of course cost me my job, but also let NCAR know that they could trust me to tell the truth. So over the next decade, I got a series of contracts from NCAR. One of the more interesting things I did for them was port their weather microphysics kernel over to a graphics processor, which produced about a 50x speed up over what they were currently doing. The microphysics kernel is the core of weather models. I started doing a similar thing for them in 2009, speeding up their radiative transfer model, before it was shut down because Kevin Trenberth figured out that he couldn't account for the missing heat. The largest project I did for NCAR was porting their WRF weather model over from Unix to Windows. Having taken you through that long, convoluted introduction, now let's get to the propaganda. There's a wall in the NCAR Museum featuring the many impacts of climate change. Let's look at some of those exhibits. More severe droughts. Drought is painful and increasingly intense. However, the actual data shows that what they're saying isn't true. This graph is the 3-year mean of U.S. precipitation going back to the year 1895. The graph is from the NOAA website, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. As you can see, the U.S. has gotten considerably wetter over the past century. In fact, the most recent 3-year period has been the wettest on record in the United States. And since the 2002 drought, there's been very little widespread drought in the United States. But prior to 50 years ago, the United States was in drought most of the time. This is the current U.S. drought map, which shows that the United States is very wet and drought is near historic lows. The only part of the United States shown as having severe drought is western New Mexico, which is getting pounded by heavy rain and snow today. So this red may well be gone in next week's map, and the United States may be severe drought free. Now let's compare this to the July 2002 map to see how much less drought we have now than we used to have. So the NCAR claim of more severe droughts simply isn't true. Next, let's look at their claim that rising seas are caused by climate change. Tide gauges from NOAA do not support this idea. This is the tide gauge from Lower Manhattan, which has data going back to before Abraham Lincoln was president. The graph shows very clearly that the rate of sea level rise has not changed over the last 120 years. At the beginning of the 20th century, sea level was rising at 2.84 millimeters per year, and it's still doing that now. If sea level were rising faster now, the slope would be steeper. In other words, there would be an upwards curvature. But this upwards curvature does not exist. There's no upwards curvature at Boston. There's no upwards curvature at Atlantic City. There's no upwards curvature at Key West, Florida. There's no upwards curvature at Alameda, California. Also interesting to note is that sea level at Alameda, California really hasn't changed at all over the last 35 years. Same story at La Jolla, California. Sea level there now is just about the same as it was 35 years ago. Sea level at Crescent City, California has been falling over the last 80 or so years, and there's definitely no upwards curvature. And sea level at Stockholm, Sweden has been falling rapidly over the last 10 or 20 years, and once again there's no upwards curvature. Long-term tide gauges do not show any indication that sea level rise rates have accelerated. Over the past 20,000 years, sea level has risen about 120 meters or 400 feet. The vast majority of that rise occurred between 14,000 years ago and 8,000 years ago. NCAR wants people to believe that this 400 feet of sea level rise is all natural, but the last couple inches are man-made. This obviously makes no sense and is propaganda rather than science. The next NCAR claim is that the weather is getting more severe due to climate change, and they cite a heavy snowstorm in Buffalo, New York during 2014 as being evidence of this change. The exhibit includes this quote, "I've lived here my whole life and I've never seen anything like it," Buffalo resident Maria Odom, 38, told CNN. That means that Maria would have been born in Buffalo in 1976. Maria would have been just a few months old during the January 1977 blizzard in Buffalo which buried this car. She was simply too young to remember the global cooling blizzard of 1977. This page is from the November 1977 edition of National Geographic. The article was titled, "The Year the Weather Went Wild," and it showed citrus crops in Florida covered with ice. It actually snowed in Miami that month, and for a while Florida was colder than Alaska. Let's think about what NCAR is doing here. They're taking anecdotal evidence quoted from CNN. And CNN interviewed a young woman who didn't remember the 1977 Buffalo blizzard. Then NCAR tries to pass this nonsense off to school children as being science. But it's not science, it's just propaganda. During the 1970s, NCAR was pushing the idea of global cooling rather than global warming. This is the July 14, 1974 edition of the Sunday Journal and Star from Lincoln, Nebraska. The article included this graph from NCAR which showed sharp global cooling from the 1940s until the 1970s. NCAR showed that 1970 was no warmer than 1870 and perhaps even a little bit cooler. Let's read through some of the article. Global climate believed returning to harsher state. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. Most people considered these conditions to be abnormal and temporary. But instead, climatologists now believe that the first half of the 20th century was blessed with unusually mild weather and that the global climate has begun returning to a harsher but more normal state. For the long run, there is mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. So climatologists at the time were blaming every form of bad weather on global cooling. All of the same types of weather which they now blame on global warming. If you look over at the lower right corner, which I've highlighted in pink, you'll see something interesting. Two American scientists discovered a statistical relationship between solar activity and winter storms in the North Pacific. If it's true, it's of overwhelming importance, says Dr. Walter Roberts of the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Remember that Walter R. Roberts was the first director of NCAR. He was a solar physicist who believed that solar activity controlled Earth's climate. Here's another article from 1973 which shows what Dr. Roberts was thinking at the time. Dr. Walter R. Roberts, a research scientist who believes sunspots directly affect the weather on Earth, says a severe drought rivaling the Dust Bowl days of the Depression may hit the Great Plains next year or by 1975. Roberts, president of the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, said yesterday an upcoming period of very little sunspot activity may signal an oncoming drought. And Dr. Roberts was correct. By March of 1977, California was facing a drought disaster. California Governor Jerry Brown said California was facing a disaster of immeasurable magnitude. Decades earlier in 1951, Dr. Roberts had already discovered a close relationship between solar flares and Earth's weather. The World's News, September 1951, Sun's Effect on the Earth. Great solar flares, streams of gas which are shot out from the face of the sun far into space at velocities as high as 200 miles a second, tend to be followed 2 days later by depressions or elevations of atmospheric pressure on Earth. The new finding of Sun-Earth relations by observers at the Harvard University Observatory at Climax, Colorado, was announced by Dr. Walter R. Roberts at the annual Arthur Lecture of the Smithsonian Institution. NCAR's current propaganda describes Dr. Roberts as an early advocate of climate change. But what they don't mention is that he was talking about climate change due to changes in solar activity rather than greenhouse gases. Now let's look at the next propaganda poster in the NCAR Museum. Our increasingly acidic oceans. Bill Dewey has raised oysters and other shellfish for 30 years along the Washington coast, but after ocean acidification contributed to an 80% die-off of the West Coast oyster population, he isn't sure what the future will look like. Once again, these claims are absurd. The oceans are not acidic, they have a pH of around 8, which is alkaline. And shellfish evolved during the Cambrian era when CO2 levels were about 15 times higher than they are now. The greatest explosion of life occurred in the oceans 540 million years ago, with atmospheric CO2 levels somewhere around 7,000 parts per million. If ocean acidification was a real problem, not only would this explosion of life never have happened, but the oceans actually would have been dead. Whatever killed off Bill Dewey's oysters was not ocean acidification. We know that in the past, shellfish thrived at much higher levels of CO2. Historical evidence shows us that ocean acidification is not a real problem. But climate scientists tend to ignore real-world evidence and rely instead on groupthink and superstition about carbon dioxide. The claim is that over the past 300 million years, ocean pH has been slightly basic, averaging about 8.2. Today it's about 8.1, a drop of 0.1 pH units. I'm going to show you now how ridiculous this claim is. This shows ocean pH measurements taken at Monterey Bay during the 1990s and early 2000s. You can see that pH varies between about 7.7 and 8.2 on a regular basis. There's a huge amount of natural variability occurring from day to day. But climate scientists claim that they know precisely what pH was over the last 300 million years. Measurements at Monterey Bay regularly vary by 0.5. But these scientists are claiming they can detect a change of 0.1 over 300 million years. It's complete nonsense. Now let's look at their next poster, Difficult Harvests. With the buildup of greenhouse gases, food production around the world is facing an uncertain future. Once again, NCAR is ignoring real-world data, which shows us that food production has skyrocketed as CO2 has increased over the last 50 or 60 years. Year after year, we see record grain crops. These are wheat yields in Europe. Corn yields in the United States. Corn yields in the United States have increased 500% since the 1940s as greenhouse gases have risen. Real-world data shows us that food production increases as CO2 increases and temperature increases. However, it has been known for hundreds of years that grain prices correlate with sunspot activity, which is exactly what NCAR's first director, Walter R. Roberts, was saying. It's unfortunate that NCAR has gotten away from their scientific roots and gotten into propaganda instead. Their next propaganda poster is Heat and Disease. Rising temperatures pose an increasing risk of dangerous illnesses. Real-world data from Oxford University shows the exact opposite. Child deaths from just about all causes have decreased sharply over the last 30 years. Respiratory disease rates have dropped in all age groups. Malnutrition rates have dropped sharply over the last 30 years, too. Poverty levels have plummeted as CO2 has risen. Life expectancy has more than doubled as CO2 has risen. Global natural disaster death rates have plummeted over the past century. The only categories of disease which have increased have been heart disease and cancer. Now let's go back and look at cynicism in this poster. When NCAR scientist Olga Wilhelmi surveyed residents in Houston, Texas, she was surprised to find that many of them suffered from the heat even though they have air conditioning. The reason? They cannot afford the electric bills to keep their air conditioners running. If climate alarmists believe this, why do they want carbon taxes which will raise electricity rates? Reality is that NCAR moved their computing facilities to Wyoming because Wyoming doesn't have the green energy taxes which Colorado does, and electricity is much cheaper up there. Here's the most disturbing exhibit of all. It's targeted at children and it's called Choose Our Future. They're telling children that they can control the climate with a vegan diet or by not driving a car. They're also telling children not to fly on airplanes, like Greta Thunberg. Reality is that China and India are building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants, and there's nothing Americans can do to control atmospheric CO2 levels. America could drop off the face of the earth and atmospheric CO2 would continue to rise. Telling children that their future is threatened by climate change and that they control the climate with their decisions is a very dangerous game. Telling children that their future depends on something which they have no control over is bound to have serious psychological impacts. The climate is completely out of their control. The nonsense from NCAR has spread down the hill to the Boulder City Council. The Boulder City Council tried to sue fossil fuel companies for wildfires, pest infestations, heat waves, and other impacts on tourism and agriculture. Boulder relies on tens of thousands of out-of-town workers driving into the city every day to work. Without those workers, the city's economy would collapse. The city of Boulder, as such, is one of the worst wasters of fossil fuels in the country. Meanwhile, the entire basis of their lawsuit is complete nonsense. Colorado tourism has increased year after year to all-time record levels. Burn acreage in the U.S. is down 80% since the 1930s, with this year being one of the lowest on record. There's no indication of intelligent thought about climate going on at the Boulder City Council or at the NCAR Museum. Climate alarmists live in a world of superstition, which they imagine to be science. I told NCAR the truth in 2003. I told them not to buy our product, and it cost me my job. And 15 years later, I'm still telling them the truth. Their climate alarmism is junk science. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.